name is Elise Bonders, and for my research, I'm focusing on the writing process, more specifically, an examination of the reflective rubric and the writing convention. The rationale behind my research is the fact that all students and all teachers hate learning and teaching the writing process. It is a very difficult and time-consuming thing to teach. And students end up becoming disconnected and disinterested in their writing because they know they have no say-so in their own scores and own grades. Therefore, I decided to look into the rubric because the students have a greater knowledge of their score in the end. Past research has shown that in the 1980s, George published writing research that claimed to help focus students' writing. He talks about 6 instructional strategies later that became known as the 6+1 writing strategy. Research done later on his research suggested that students need to self-assess and reflect on their work, and therefore it prompted the reflective rubric now seen in 6+1 ways of writing. My method for my research included 17 of my 3rd grade students, 8 girls, 9 boys. And I have a variety of ethnicities in my classroom. There are 10 Caucasians, 4 African Americans, 2 Mexican Americans, and 1 Chinese American. My materials needed were first and foremost the consent form sent home to the parents, and then the assent form for the students themselves. Secondly, I needed a master rubric for myself to grade both the pre-test and the post-test for my students. I also needed a reflective rubric that was on the students' level so they could look at and grade their own work. And finally, I needed some teacher-created handouts that exemplified the various conventions that were taught in class. During my first week, we talked about various ways of using the rubric when I introduced it in this week. The first week was mainly focused on how we grade, how we score based on the rubrics we use. And in this same week, I also gave the baseline writing inventory, which was my pre-assessment grading the students' writing at the beginning before the rubric was ever shown, was ever even applied to their writing. In weeks 2 and 3, I begin each period by discussing various writing conventions, from capitalization to punctuation, spelling, separating ideas, and grammar. Then the next period, we would spend 25 minutes on a writing prompt, which they would write on whatever prompt it was today. And then they would spend the last 2 minutes editing and grading themselves on the rubric. And finally, on the last day, which was the post-assessment, they had the same 25 minutes and gave themselves one final score on the rubric to see how they were doing. This is an example of a reflective rubric that I would give to my students. It had all the 5 elements of conventions, from capitalization to separating ideas. It was on a 6-point scale, 6 points given no mistakes to 1 point where there were 7 or more mistakes. And then they would give themselves a score out of 30, explain why they gave themselves a score, and emphasize what they did well and what they needed to work on for the next time. So my ultimate goal of this research was to see a gradual change and improvement in each student's writing, regardless of their beginning level, showing that their reflection made the students focus and reevaluate their work every time. My results showed a nice improvement. The pre-test, the class average was a 19.08 out of 30, with a standard deviation of 4.9. Then, by the 3rd week, the post-test showed an improvement an average of 22.35 out of 30, with an improvement of 3.29 points and a standard deviation of 3.83. To determine my statistical significance, I calculated the p-value. The p-value ended up being a .021, making it statistically significant because it's below .05. This graph here shows the writing scores from the pre-test in the dark blue to the post-test in the light blue of each of the individual students, showing either their improvement, their similar score, or their decrease in scores. But mainly it shows the substantial increase of most students. So overall, based on the results of this study, it suggests that the rubric is a very effective way to improve the students' writing skills and scores. So during these 3 weeks, the scores did not only improve, but so did the students' overall scoring of their own work, showing that they were able to evaluate their own skills and their own accuracy of their work. Okay, there are some implications of my research still. When considering the main question that prompted this research, I have, as an observer, had to question if the improvements were solely based on the rubric that I created, or whether it had to do with the continual practice of the writing in general. Because writing for 25 minutes every day, regardless of if there was a rubric, could show improvement. But I still feel like the addition of a writing rubric was a good aid for the students. I had various limitations to my research. One of the main ones was the time constraint, because the data collected I felt was few because of the limited time allowed. I only had 3 weeks to not only introduce the rubric, help practice rubric, but give at least a few weeks of prompting in order to see an improvement based on writing. So I would suggest extending the time period allowed for this research. The second limitation is the amount of participants in my study. I was only allowed to use the students out in my class during this time. This wasn't even my full class, but there was no other time for this study to be conducted, so I only used about 3/4 of my students. Other limitations were based on the writing process themselves, such as the prompts given to the participants could have affected their writing, such as if they didn't like the prompt, they didn't understand the prompt, they just weren't motivated to write on that prompt. Also, the length of the students' writing could have affected the way they were scored, because in my class I had varying abilities and writing lengths, such as I had some students write 2 to 3 sentences, other students write 3 to 4 pages, and I feel like the students who wrote 3 to 4 pages would have a lot more mistakes in their writing. And also, as mentioned earlier, the repeated practice of writing could increase their scores. And finally, I feel like student motivation on a daily basis could have affected their writing. If they just weren't into writing that day, their writing would have turned out differently. Okay. Future implications. If repeated, I feel like the researcher should extend the time frame of the study. I feel like either you could do it 2 ways, either a longer chunk of time, such as a month or 2, or alternatively, repeatedly done throughout the year, such as 2 weeks in the beginning of the year, 2 weeks in the middle of the school year, and 2 weeks at the end. So like either way would show a good and gradual improvement of the students. Secondly, I would like to increase the sample size. whether it's using my entire class or trying to even use the entire grade level if possible. And finally, the prompts themselves should be altered so that a type or question or prompt does not require or cause students to halt on their writing. So I feel like each prompt should be more vague and more applicable to students' interests. Okay, thank you very much.